Lord Monckton, I know that you have been a voice out there amongst this climate change hysteria, and you've been one of those dissenting voices that has really had a lot of really good points. I know you've been part of research projects where you guys have talked about in depth how they're over-exaggerating their climate science to kind of fit their political agendas. Can you tell us about that?
Let's start with the hurricane, because we're being told by the usual suspects that this hurricane has definitely been made worse by global warming. It's caused by global warming. It's unprecedented. It's never happened on this scale before. Never has there been such a strong hurricane. Every single one of those statements is simply a lie. And it's a lie peddled by what I call the climate communists. These are people whose real hatred is of capitalism, and they are willing, for the sake of advancing communism or fascism, whichever it is this week, they are willing to sacrifice the lives of those who are in harm's way by trying to distract attention away from the rescue effort and onto trying to blame capitalism for storms like this, which happen every so often. The remarkable thing about Hurricanes Harvey and Irma was that until they came along, with Jose just behind them, and I'll tell you why there were three of them in succession in a moment, until they came along, there had been no landfalling Category 3 or above serious hurricane anywhere on the Atlantic seaboard of the United States for 12 years, since Hurricane Wilma. 12 years. Now, that's the longest period without a Category 3 or above hurricane striking the American Atlantic seaboard since the records were first kept 150 years ago.
Well, the 12 years kind of goes right in with the solar cycles that are supposedly 11-year cycles. So that's kind of interesting that you said that it's been 12 years.
Well, there's more to it than that. If we mention the sun, there have recently been three very strong X-class flares, solar flares. And Piers Corbyn of Weather Action, whom I've just been talking to about this, says that he's noticed there's a very clear link between these very big solar flares that happen from time to time. These are huge outbursts of energy from the sun. And the sudden heating up of the problem actually is in the eastern Atlantic, where these storms form, if the weather gets warm enough for them to form there. And solar flares help that to happen. Because, of course, at this time of year, once the storm gets across to the western Atlantic, into the Caribbean, there the water is going to be the water that everybody goes to the Caribbean for. It's warm. It's 30 degrees Celsius, 100 Fahrenheit, whatever, and that's enough to feed a storm and turn it into a hurricane. So these are natural events. And let's just look at some of the Lulus that have happened before. Galveston in Texas in 1900, between 8 and 12,000 people were killed in the storm and the floods that happened then. That was probably the worst natural disaster in United States history. So if anyone tells you that Hurricane Irma is a 1 in 500-year hurricane, which is another lie that the left are peddling at the moment, that too is not true, because the Galveston hurricane showed that these things were happening long before global warming caused by us could possibly have been fairly blamed. There was the Labor Day storm in Florida in 1935.
Exactly. Can you believe that you actually have hysterical climate change enthusiasts out there thinking that this is a direct result of President Trump having removed some of his climate regulations?
This is how far the climate communists are from reality now. They are desperate, and I'll tell you why in a moment they are desperate. But first of all, Hurricane Mitch in 1998 killed 11,000 people in Central America. Fifi Arlene, 1974, 8,000 people. And then Flora, 1963, 7,000 people. And at the moment, the combined total from Harvey and Irma is likely to be around 100. So we're not looking at unprecedented death rates. We are looking at an unprecedented number of people now living in Hurricane Alley, living in harm's way. Florida was left by the Native Americans more or less alone because they knew hurricanes came in and devastated it every few years. And it's only we arrogant Westerners building these huge tower blocks and things right in the line of fire that causes the kind of damage it causes. But even then, there has been a steady decline throughout the last century in the amount of money lost through damage caused by storms. That's partly because buildings tend to be built these days hurricane-proof. Private houses, not so much, but bigger hotels and so forth. They're built to take it. And so gradually we are learning that if we want to live in Hurricane Alley, we must build so that things don't fall down every time you get a big storm.
Well, you know, the Florida Keys is...
On the list I've just read out, you're going to get them every 12 years or so.
Exactly. And the Florida Keys, the location of it, I mean, it's essentially just a patch of sand really in the ocean, and to think that it's not going to be hit and devastated by hurricanes is ridiculous. And the fact that you could even have tsunamis.
It's more or less in the central Caribbean, and the Caribbean basin, which therefore confines the sea, and it's quite close to the tropics, so you get a lot of sun. That's going to be warm water, and it's warm water combined with cooler air above, paradoxically, that makes these storms spin. It's the differential in temperatures between the warm water below that has to be at least 26 Celsius. And the cooler air above, and it's that differential that causes the storms to spin up to the magnitudes we're seeing now. But this is nothing new. It's nothing exceptional. It's nothing whatever to do with man-made global warming, because the global temperatures have risen over the last 150 years by about 1 Celsius degree. Now, that's simply not enough in the order of things to make a vast difference. And, of course, there are many benefits to the extra CO2 in the atmosphere, not the least of which is that the mass of green plants on Earth and trees, despite all the deforestation we hear about, has actually increased by between 15 and, according to a latest report, 50% over the last 60 years. So what you're getting always from the far-out left, who are now increasingly out of touch with reality, is this complete nonsense. They will just lie. Every time a big weather event comes along now, they'll immediately say, this is unprecedented, never been seen anything like this before, never have we recorded anything like this in recorded history. Actually, we have. It's been seen time and time and
exactly.
time again.
It's been documented time and time again. We've seen this happen over and over. There's images as proof.
They're getting really desperate. They're getting really desperate because they know of the research that you and I talked of when I was with you in Montana at that great conference earlier this year. And that research has now come to its fruition. We are now just about to hear back from the peer reviewers at a learned journal. And so far, nobody has been able to find a hole in our argument. We can prove that the amount of global warming that will happen per doubling of CO2 concentration cannot exceed 1.5 Celsius degrees if you correct the mistakes we have found in the climate models and assume that in everything else they've got it right. 1.5 Celsius, which is their minimum, now becomes the maximum, and that's simply not enough to consider.
Let's show some images of the hurricane while we're talking about this stuff, guys. Just because really and truly the devastation that we're seeing here, as Lord Christopher Monckton is telling us, it is devastating. It's horrible. We won't see many things like this in our lifetime necessarily, but our lifetimes are relatively short. And when you look at history...
I'm not saying that. I'm saying this will happen roughly every 12 years.
Oh, okay.
These big storms have happened roughly every 12 years throughout the last century. There's nothing new about it at all. And the only thing that's new about this one is that there was a complete gap of 12 years during which there were no land-forming Atlantic hurricanes in the United States. And that's the longest period since records began 150 years ago. So we are not talking of an unprecedented, terrible hurricane. We're talking of an unprecedented period of calm, 12 years of it, before these hurricanes that are now coming in. So, if anything, what is beginning to happen is that as the world gets just that little bit warmer, the temperature differentials, which are the things that really drive hurricanes, are beginning to diminish. And therefore, one would expect perhaps to see slightly fewer of them than we have in the past, not more. And this is where, your average climate communist doesn't know any of the real underlying science. And the important thing, the important driver in all this is still the sun. We've had these 3 massive X-class flares coming out of a sunspot region on the sun just over the last week. That's the kind of thing that has been shown in the past, with Piers Corbyn's done a lot of work on this, has been shown in the past to cause hurricanes, and Dr. Klotzbach, who has analyzed Hurricane Irma, done a detailed study, and has found absolutely nothing unprecedented or unusual about it at all. Now, that is no comfort to those who are being killed by it and whose homes are having their roofs torn off and their windows smashed in. Every hurricane of this magnitude is going to do a lot of damage where it makes landfall. And the United States, unfortunately, a large part of your Atlantic seaboard is in Hurricane Alley. And the lesson, I think, to learn from this is, first of all, one should pay absolutely no attention to those malicious climate communists who are willing to exploit the misery of those who are suffering in these storms. And I get very angry when I hear these people playing politics with the lives of Floridians, the lives of people in Texas, in Houston, and I get very tired of them saying if only Houston had had complex communist zoning laws like the rest of the country, then it wouldn't have suffered from the floods so badly. Yes, it would. It would have suffered just as badly, but it would also have been trillions of dollars down because of the cost of paying for the socialist regulation that Texas alone has been sensible enough not to inflict upon itself. So we've got to expect or try to require the climate communists to grow up, stop trying to preach to us about how every passing extreme weather event is unique, or even to try and they've been trying to preach to us that these extreme weather events are becoming more frequent. The answer is actually no, they're not. And their own climate communist organization, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is entirely, nobody elects that, an entirely appointed communist body, they themselves have had to admit, not once but twice, in their special report on extreme weather scenarios in 2012 and in 2013 in the fifth assessment report on the climate, of which I was an expert reviewer, they were compelled to say, because we made them say it, that there is no real evidence that a little bit of warmer weather is going to increase, rather than in fact decrease, the incidence of extreme weather. And the big question you can always ask to the climate communists is this: okay, so you say the science is settled, tell us then what is the ideal global mean surface temperature? And if they can't tell you that, then how can they tell you that a 1 degree increase in global surface temperature over the next century is somehow going to, because that's all we're going to get, is somehow going to be bad for the planet? The answer is, if they can't even say what the ideal surface temperature of the planet is, then they can't say that any amount of warming is going to be a bad thing. And they have never yet answered that question. So everything they say is cant. It is directed towards trying to damage, at the moment, the Trump administration, because Donald Trump has decided very courageously, and he was put under more pressure on this than on anything else by the enemies of reason and of capitalism. But he stood firm because he remembers that the working people of the United States, the people in the coal industry in West Virginia, they, for instance, they don't want to be told by the climate communists that they've been killing the planet, because they haven't. It isn't true. And when you see these wretches deciding that they are going to exploit the misery of everyone who suffers with every passing extreme weather event, so as to try to blame capitalism for that extreme weather, when they know perfectly well that these extreme weather events have been going on for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and that there's nothing at all special about the number or the frequency or the intensity or the duration or the size of any of these events, then this is despicable, it is outrageous, and everyone who is a red-blooded American should rise up against these climate communists. And I think we've now we've got to start sending some of these people to jail. We've got to
Exactly. They need to be put in prison. These climate communists are no better than the people out there looting right now, and the businesses price gouging, and the people that are just going out there making things worse and capitalizing off, like you said, this tragedy, other people's misery. And, you know, these climate pushers are not going to let a tragedy go to waste. They are definitely going to take advantage of the fact that people are in a state of panic and fear, reasonably so, to thus generate hysteria so that more people go out and watch Al Gore's movie, so to speak.
Here's a simple question. that you can ask to any climate communist that rings in and says, oh, that's just Monckton, and we all know he's paid by the fossil fuel industry. Actually, I'm not. My check from ExxonMobil didn't arrive last month, or any month. But here's what I think you can say to them. They, or the climate communists, say that the natural greenhouse effect is 32 Kelvin. They say that the pre-industrial temperature was 287 Kelvin. That means that the maximum feedback fraction on the mad assumption, the extreme assumption that all of the greenhouse effect was caused by feedback and not even by CO2 at all, that gives you a feedback fraction of 32 over 287, which is 0.11. It's about 1/9. Now, their minimum estimate of the feedback fraction is 0.23, which is double the absolute maximum it could possibly or impossibly be. And that's how we know that they've got this wrong, that they've screwed up. And they know we know, and they're wriggling like stuck pigs. I was in Moscow 10 days ago giving the results and talking to some of the members of the Russian Academy of Sciences about it. And you can see that they are beginning to realize that they've had communism. They don't want it again. So when all the climate communists turned up in Moscow 10 days ago, I went along, and the climate communists were not given the usual sort of adulation that they meet everywhere else in the world, because Russia's been there, done that, had communism, got the T-shirt, doesn't want it. And so academician after academician was standing up and saying this has been exaggerated, the uncertainties are bigger than they say, and it's not sensible for Russia yet to sign the Paris Accord because the science is most certainly not settled. And of course, when they heard my result, they're absolutely fascinated. They're working on it now. And country by country, gradually, they're beginning to look at what we're doing. They're beginning to find that it's right. And they're beginning to find, therefore, that we are able to prove that for 120 years, of order 100% of all scientific papers written on how much warming we're going to get have exaggerated, and exaggerated by typically somewhere between a factor of 3 and a factor of 10. That's how bad the exaggerations have been. And those days are now drawing to a close. Our paper is eventually going to be published.
That's right. And you know, they're just doing this so that they can push their agendas. And, you know, a lot of people have realized by now that the Green Party is really essentially a front for the Communist Party.
That's right.
That's why a lot of people call it the Watermelon Party, because it's green on the outside, red on the inside. But, you know, it's kind of interesting here that you also have people saying that, you know, although it looks like communism and parts of it and elements are, it also is tying in a technocracy where you have these scientists and technocrats wanting to dictate policy in the name of science.
Course, is fascism. And what you've got is the communists will always try to call the fascist extreme right. In fact, both the communists and the fascists are extreme left. You know, the Hitler's party was the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany, and it was the first party to promote the environmentalist agenda. And why? As a means of controlling the people. And that's what totalitarianism is all about. It's about absolute control over the totality of everybody's life, down to the last light bulb flickering because it's filled with poisonous mercury rather than a proper Edison lamp that you can actually read by. And this is what climate communism is. It's actually becoming fascism. And
yes,
this fascist elite of climate extremists who are now now about once a week somebody goes public and says that I should be executed, if you please, for daring to do scientific research that shows these people are wrong.
Of course, you know, they want to essentially stone and flog the people who have dissenting voices against communism. Essentially, anyone who is a Trump supporter, they're labeled a Nazi, and they justify physical violence and force against them. So because, you know, maybe I've seen you, Lord Monckton, wear your Make America Great hat again. So in some of these people's minds, you are this horrible Nazi, and it's just the hysteria that the mainstream media has perpetuated. We all know that that's not true.
Mainstream media are now fascist. That's what they really are, not so much communist as fascist. These are people who think that there should be a governing class of huge corporate leaders, these billionaire socialists or communists or fascists, call them what you will, who have bought into this global warming thing because it's a way of they and their mates getting control over everybody else's lives and everybody else's businesses. That's classic fascism. That's what it is. And so what we're dealing with is both climate communism and climate fascism. The extreme left, the two wings of the extreme left, if you like, have always been communism and fascism, and you'll find them united now in support of this climate nonsense, which is now on the verge of collapsing altogether, because as soon as our paper finally appears, and if the present journal doesn't get on with it, because it's a week late coming back with the peer reviews, then we are going to go outside the climate field, because the error that's been made is an error of mathematics that climatology borrowed from somewhere else. And we are going to go to a journal of control theory, explain in great detail how the climatologists do it and how they get this control theory wrong, and then ask for comments from the control theory community about the competing methods, the method that we would suggest, which is in line with existing control theory, and the method the climatologists have been using since 120 years ago, when they didn't do it right, and they never have done it right. And it's rather interesting that they insist that there's this consensus in climate science. What it turns out is that this consensus in climate science is at odds with a much wider consensus in mainstream science in control theory. And climate science is out of line with not just the consensus, but the proven results of control theory. Because, see, in control theory, which governs how feedbacks work, you can build an electronic circuit to measure it. That's what we did. We used one of our government laboratories to do it. I can't tell you which one. They'd never forgive me for being known
okay.
as the laboratory.
Yes, don't give us anything that's confidential or secret. Don't give us anything like that. But, Lord Monckton, you have really filled in a lot of the blanks here. You've really got the information out here to our viewers to allow them to really and truly see through the lies that the mainstream media is perpetuating and that these climate change enthusiasts are perpetuating. Well, this is probably going to wrap up our interview here, Lord Monckton. But if you want to just make one quick closing statement and tell us where people can find more of your information and go follow you.
Right. The best place to go is whatsupwiththat.com. WATTS upwiththat.com, or one word, .com, because that's the biggest climate change site in the world. It is a healthily but sensibly skeptical site. It doesn't say there's no such thing as a greenhouse effect. Yes, there is. What it does do is give you the straightforward science without the fascist or communist twisting you will get in the mainstream so-called, or the Marxstream media, as I call them. The time has come for ordinary working people to stand together with your president, who has spoken for them and continues to speak for them, against the fascist communist governing class, the Washington swamp, which he is so busy draining. And
exactly.
let us see these people off. And I hope that by the end of this year, there will be gales of laughter worldwide as everyone finally realizes just how wrong these climate communists and thermo-fascists actually were. They've been wrong from the start, and we are on the verge now of proving it absolutely.